Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 47. And today I'm joined by Tanya Janca to chat about application security. And an episode on security is kind of long overdue, to be honest. The closest we've had so far is episode 8, where I was joined by Christos Matskas to talk about identity. But obviously security is quite a broad term, so it's really amazing to have you on, Tanya, to talk about it. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan.
You're welcome. So a proper introduction. So Tanya is the founder and CEO of We Hack Purple, which is an online learning academy, community and weekly podcast that revolves around teaching everyone to create secure software. And she's the director of developer relationships at Bright and best-selling author of the book Alice and Bob Learn Application Security. So I've given you a brief intro there. I don't know whether I missed anything. Can you tell listeners a bit more about yourself and what you do?
Absolutely, Dan. So I was a software developer for around 17 years. That's what I went to college for. And then I met a hacker. and he's like, let me show you how I can break into one of your apps. And then I became super fascinated, and him and I became friends. And then eventually he became my professional mentor. And slowly I switched over from being a software developer to being a penetration tester. So penetration testing is, like one person attacking an app for, perhaps 10 days, analyzing every single security potential thing. But then I discovered AppSec was a job, and that was not hanging out by yourself a lot in freezing cold data centers like what I was doing. You got to hang out with software developers all the time and help them make more secure software. And as a very extroverted social butterfly, that made more sense to me. And so I still get to do testing, but I also get to help fix things, explain things, create, a plan within their system development lifecycle for where the security stuff happens. And just, it turned out that was more what my personality was meant for. And then, this might sound weird, but I started speaking at conferences because you get in free. And
that's a good reason.
Yeah. So the Canadian government has a really small training budget, and that's where I was working. And I was like, well, if I just spend hours and hours and hours creating a talk and applying to tons of conferences, if I get into one, I get this free ticket. And so I was doing that a lot for maybe 2 years. Then Microsoft reached out to me and said, hey, would you want to do that? But as a job. It's called developer advocacy. And I was like, is this like a prank call? Like, you're going to pay me to do my hobby that I do for free? What? Yeah. And so then eventually I started my own company, We Hack Purple, where I still do give secure coding training, AppSec training, etc. But I've built this online community of maybe 6,500 people that want to learn how to make more secure software, that do incident response, etc. And so we have courses in there, and we have all sorts of things that we do. And then now we've joined forces with Bright Security. And so Bright Security makes a dynamic web app scanner. So pew, 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 pew. Very serious stuff. Yeah. And so basically, like, on their behalf, I get to speak at conferences, write blog posts, do research, help them make their product better. And we call that developer relations, that weird type of job where you're like, I help, and talk about how I help. A lot. Dan, I never knew that there could be a job like this. It is a very interesting field.
So throughout the course of this recording, are you going to persuade me to slowly pivot? Because it sounds really interesting.
I'm definitely going to try to convince you and all the listeners. I have a super huge bias. So for me, like, I loved making software, but after 17 years, it wasn't like as exciting as it was before, and things kept changing. And I was like, oh, another framework. Okay. And I still liked it, but it's very fascinating to be able to see the security of the entire organization. Or even like now I get to do little consulting sessions with all these different companies, and being able to meet 100 different AppSec teams and see how they do AppSec. Like, that's been really fascinating. And so I guess security, there's always a new cool thing. And with AppSec, you get to hang out with software developers, and those are my people. So yeah, it works out.
Yeah, it'd be definitely good to drill into some of those. But before we do talk about AppSec, I'm going to do this episode's listener mention. And this one goes out to Hannah, who very kindly bought me a few coffees via Buy Me Coffee, keeping me caffeinated and supporting the podcast. And she sent me a message saying, I've listened and loved every single episode of your podcast, so I wanted to say thank you. Really like that you always make a point of explaining technical terms that you or your guests use, and the show notes are very detailed and useful. Definitely my favourite podcast. So a massive thank you, Hannah, for this. Seriously, it totally made my day, so thank you. And if you want to get mentioned on the show, just send a tweet using hashtag unhandledexception, or feel free to buy me a coffee like Hannah did, hinted. All feedback is greatly appreciated, and I'm Dracan on Twitter, which is DRACAN. And don't forget that this podcast now has its own Slack channel. So if you head over to unhandledexceptionpodcast.com, you'll see a big shiny Slack link there. And lastly, a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. So, application security. So this is actually obviously quite a broad topic. And I guess at a high level, it would be probably useful to differentiate between like the different types of security. Like I think there's terms like AppSec, InfoSec, NetSec, and there's probably a bunch of others. Is there an easy way of defining what falls under AppSec, or if it's easier, what doesn't fall under AppSec?
Okay, so when people ask me what application security is, it is every single thing that you do to try to ensure the software your organization creates, maintains, or just has is secure. And so you can work full-time in application security and create a formal program and make sure that you have security activities during the system development lifecycle. So let's say, you go to the project kickoff meeting, you're like, hi, I'm Tanya. I am your dedicated AppSec nerd. And I will be here with you the whole way through. I'm going to check in and I'm going to give you security requirements. I'm going to go over your design with you. I'm going to give you some tools to look at. I'm going to test and tell you what I've found and ask potentially for you to fix a few things. I will be here from the beginning to the end to help ensure your software is secure. But AppSec is also a software developer listening to a podcast like this, hearing about, I heard this framework has a vulnerability in this version, so I'm going to go to work and check it out. And one of our apps has that version. Maybe we should upgrade off of it because I heard it's really not very safe to have that on the internet. That person's also doing AppSec. They're just less formal about it. So all the things you do to try to make sure your software is secure, I call that application security.
It definitely sounds like having a dedicated AppSec person on the team makes the value of security much more visible to the business. I guess a lot of businesses only see the value after a breach.
That's it, though. Companies often say, security is not an income generator. It costs money. It's not adding value to the product. And obviously, since it's my passion and I'm very positively biased, but in my opinion, security is part of quality now. Customers expect that the products that they buy are safe and secure and have been tested. And whenever something bad happens, like hacks where there's data breaches, attacks where, customers are harmed, they're like, I put my faith and trust in you, and now it's gone, and I'm going to switch providers, or I'm going to go to your competitor, etc. So we are adding business value, but it's not as direct because that final customer, if everything goes perfectly, they're unaware that there are so many security features built in, right? Ideally, we want to make it the way the product works is secure rather than you have to do these 5 extra steps. If you've done a really good job, they don't even notice the security, or they do, but it's not painful. And they don't understand, yes, you had to do a multi-factor authentication challenge. You had to enter in this code, but there's 26 other things we also did to protect you. And so I don't think it's a cost center. To me, it does add value, but a lot of companies don't feel that way or see it that way yet.
Yeah, it's hidden value until, obviously, as you say, if there's a data breach, then the cost of that's when the business really knows that they should have put that money up front. If the business has agreed to have a dedicated AppSec person like yourself, then it means that the business appreciates security, which is quite important, where a lot of businesses probably don't. But For, as you mentioned, for just normal developers that are just like listening to podcasts, trying to learn, trying to improve their own skill set. I know you've mentioned your community. What are the best like ways for them to just upskill? And maybe as a team, I'm trying to think of maybe some kind of like team building exercise which the whole team can do together, that kind of thing.
So there are huge innovations right now in the cybersecurity training area. So that industry is a 150 million per year industry as of 2020. And so like I give training where there's videos and articles and checklists, etc. But there are companies where they have entire platforms built to give you coding challenges that then you have to go. It's almost like a video game where it's like, I'm doing this challenge and they'll show you some code and it's like, how would you exploit this code? Or the ones that I like better are, spot the vulnerability and then repair it. Like fix this, like you're looking at it and, you're taking input, then you're doing inline SQL and no input validation. And then you're just sending it to the database. What could be wrong here? And the idea is that they look at that. They're like, oh, there's no input validation. Oh, and, they should be using a parameterized query, et cetera. Right. And so I feel like some of them really focus on hacking, which if you're a software developer, that's not really the skill you need to polish. That's more like a pen tester skill. But if it's, doing code review and how to spot things that are out of place, repairing code, like we found this bug in this code, how would you fix that? How would you remediate this problem? Because that's what they're going to need to do all the time. And so you can compete with each other on platforms like that. There's also, so I'm super biased because I train lots of companies all the time still. And so going in and as a group, learning a lesson, then talking about the thing. So for instance, I'm kind of obsessed with design and building security concepts into your application. So let's say you're doing, assume breach and you're also doing, let's say, zero trust, and you want to put those concepts into your application. It's like, how would I do that? How would I have design my application in a way where I assume one day there probably will be a breach? How can I minimize that damage? How can I make sure the security team's alerted immediately? How can I make sure I'm logging all the right stuff so that when something bad happens, I can investigate, but I'm not logging stuff that's really sensitive and inappropriate to log. And so going through those things and talking about them together and comparing it to your business, like how could we do attack surface reduction in regard to this or in regard to that? So it sounds weird, but sometimes when you're learning together, you're all in the same room and you're discussing and talking about things and people are like, well, we have this one app where we're doing this. Does that seem good? I'm like, let's dig into this together. And then like remember we talked about threat modeling? All right. How about we threat model it right now together? And then they all kind of learn that, but it also solves their business problem. I know that might sound weird, but I find a lot of times software developers can feel a bit nervous to talk about security things in front of their peers because they're super duper experts at software development, but because they're not a security professional, they don't know all the stuff. And I don't know about you, Dan, but I have in the past had run-ins with security teams where they made me feel very stupid. And they're like, well, if you were a good dev, there would never have been any vulnerabilities when we ran the scan. So no, we're not going to help you because you should know when you suck. And it's just... So I feel like some developers have been like hit with a stick by security teams. And so then, burned once, twice shy, like, oh, I'm afraid to say, oh, I think it's this, or we're doing that. Is that okay? If you are a security person and you're listening to this, if you can make it a safe place for them to ask questions where no one's going to tell them you're dumb or you should have known this, you'll get way better. And so if you can create an environment like that, when you're trying to learn new things, then because when one person puts their hand up and asks a question, there's usually anywhere from 2 to 10 other people that were thinking it, but they're like, well, I don't want to look dumb and ask. So yeah, I find that as silly as it sounds, like just having open discussions, because eventually someone asks a question about a real app, and then that's when it gets really good.
I think what you just said then kind of applies to so much more than just security. And I've seen that in teams where it's like, you should have known that or whatever. And it's not just security, it's any aspect of, I was going to say software development, but it's being a human, isn't it? It's kind of, everyone has different skill sets, everyone has different backgrounds. There's no such thing as a stupid question. And company culture around what's the term, where everyone feels safe to ask questions, to put their hands up, I don't know this, or can you help me with this? I think that just makes such better teams.
Yes. So I say this a lot in my book. If we fall into an unknown state, that is often where vulnerabilities happen. So if you don't catch an error and your app doesn't know what to do next, and then, a system error goes onto the screen or whatever, but it's the same thing with humans. If we don't know what comes next, we feel uncertain. That's where a lot of vulnerabilities lie. And if you feel like, oh, if I ask for help, they're going to make me feel dumb and make me feel insecure in my job, it's like, well, then I'm just going to guess, or I'm going to go look on Stack Overflow and just, pick the thing at the top and copy and paste it in, and I'm sure it's fine. And I do not mean to pick on Stack Overflow. I think it's awesome. But a lot of people don't know there's a security area. You can look to find the most secure way to do the cool thing because they're afraid to ask, because they've been whacked on the nose with newspaper like 10 times by some security professionals. Yeah, I had a lot of bad. When I was a developer, I remember saying to one of my friends as the security guy was walking up the hall, I was like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how inappropriate is it for me to hide under my desk now? And he laughed really hard. I'm like, Dr. No's coming to tell me I suck. So I've tried to be more friendly. I've tried to be more like, let's negotiate. Like, I know you have a business reason you need to do this. The way that you're planning is presents high risk. Can we come out with a solution that's medium risk or low risk instead? And I'll help you find it. So I try to do a lot of compromising and negotiating. Who knew that would be so important in a technical job?
Well, you did actually mention in that conversation falling into an unknown state as well. And I know in our shared notes, I quite liked one of your suggestions, which was a bit of a play on the word of the podcast name, unhandled exception, where you said about that we could actually talk about falling into unknown states, and like the example you gave about unhandled exceptions bubbling up to the top and maybe showing information it shouldn't. So is that a good one to start with?
Yes, it really is. So whenever you do a thing in a program, ideally, you have a try and a catch. So you go do the thing, and if there's an error, you have something to catch and handle that error. And when I say handle, I don't mean do nothing. Seriously, Dan, I have reviewed so much code where it's like if, and then all the things, and then else, and then it's just empty. I'm like, no, that's not the, oh, come on. And so I feel like all application errors need to be caught, which means don't just let the system have a system error. I don't want a stack trace on the screen. I don't want SQL Server errors on the screen, because then our app looks unprofessional, but also our app doesn't know what to do next. And when it doesn't know what to do next, I don't know how to say this, Dan, but a lot of vulnerabilities are in there. Like when you're a pen tester and you're fuzzing an input. So that means you're putting random stuff in to see what happens. And it's like error, error, error. And you're getting the same error, and that's cool. But then you get a different error. I'm like, ooh, yeah, let's dig in. What was that input? Okay, I'm going to elaborate and change this around and see what I can get to. And I have found some weird things doing that. And so when you catch your error, then you should handle it. That means do something useful. Generally, it means provide a custom error message or a standard error message that you have across your entire application, but basically something you wrote, not a stack trace, not an SQL Server error, with details that an attacker or a pen tester can use to then further exploit your system. My very first conference talk was called How to Hack Your Own Apps. And in it, there is a search field and you could search for stuff. And I'm like, cool, I'm going to search for Tanya. And then I find the one record that says Tanya. And then, of course, I try to do an SQL injection with the audience. So I, on purpose, made mistakes. So I'm like, oh, or 1 = 1. And then it's like, oh, it errored. And then the SQL Server tells us, oh, you have an open single quote with no closed single quote. I'm like, oh, thank you for helping me fix my syntax. That was really helpful, SQL Server. So then I make the audience help me fix it. And then eventually we get it, right? Like eventually we have the right code. And then all of the usernames, passwords, and everything falls to the screen. I'm like, now imagine this was your app. How long did that take us? 3 minutes, right? Every single one of your inputs is a potential attack vector. And so then I go over how to fix that. So just for anyone that's listening, if you have, an input that goes and makes a query to the database, you want to use a parameterized query. You want to validate that input is what you're looking for. So you have an approved or accepted list of characters that are cool, and you let those in. You don't make a list of bad characters. You make a list of cool, good characters. And then you want to use content security policy header, because that also will tell you if there's other external things that you're using. And with those three things, then you can make sure that you don't accidentally have some sort of injection vulnerability in that one field. But basically, when you don't validate that what you're getting is good, weird stuff happens, Dan. And when your app goes into that weird place where it's not sure what to do, if you have if, and then you like if this, and if you don't have an else, or you don't, if you have a case statement, like select this, if there's no otherwise or anything at the end to do that final catch, your app has no idea what to do. And the testers might not have been able to make it fall into that state, but the pen tester probably will, or the malicious actor will. And then our app does not know what to do. And it does weird stuff.
It surprised me with you mentioned about SQL injection. And I know for quite a long time that was top of like the OWASP top 10. And I don't know, it's like most code bases I've worked on for a long time have used some kind of ORM, so like Entity Framework or whatever, which kind of fix that. So it really surprised me that it's been top 10 for so long, because for me, I would have to really, really work hard to actually introduce that vulnerability.
Yes. So if you're using a modern framework like Ruby, like basically all the modern frameworks have some security features built in, and some of them, like Ruby, you'd have to pry them off in order to make a vulnerability like that, which is awesome. Thumbs up to everyone using new modern frameworks. A lot of the types of injection that are out there in the world are either legacy applications, because we tend to spend all of our security time and effort on the cool new things coming out. And sometimes we forget about the old dusty things that are still on the internet and still need protection. And sometimes it's that you're doing such a weird, unusual thing that you have to do it in a weird way. You're not just doing a regular search. You're doing something that is very unique. And then inadvertently, you don't realize you get it to there. So for instance, there's operating system injection. And so you're like, oh, I did use a store procedure to get it to the database. And then it was executed from, like we took that command from the database and did this. And it's like, but you didn't check on your operating system because you were only working hard to secure the web app itself. And once you got past that, you assumed you were safe. It's like, or Dan, let's say, you have a beautiful GUI front end and you have, 50 APIs behind it that get called to do various bidding. Then some of those APIs call other APIs or call a serverless app, etc. When the API calls another thing, because it's behind their firewall, a lot of devs just don't do the same security work or testing that they would. They don't authenticate or authorize. They don't follow, harden it the same way. They're like, oh, it's in our network, it's fine. And it's like, well, if I can get a command in the GUI to the API, but it doesn't hit there, it could still hit the next API or the serverless app, or, when you run the command on the operating system. So sometimes they just worry about what is directly on the internet and they forget actually all the stuff behind the firewall is really important too. It's very valuable and we still want to protect it. So it sounds weird, but yeah, there's a lot of old legacy stuff with giant gaping holes in it, or new cool fun stuff that's on the inside of the network. And then people think it's safe and it's not. I feel like a doomsday sayer when I say that.
I guess that's it. It's kind of like if you're working on something that's like completely private, like a lot of the microservices, air quotes, are private, internal. And so, okay, that doesn't need authentication. That's fine. But then if an attacker can get into just any small machine on the network at all, then they've got full access to that, which might have, if that's unauthenticated, that might have full access to all the database data. So yeah, it's kind of,
yeah.
Is this what the term defense in depth means, or is that kind of slightly different?
So defense in depth means more than one layer of defense or mitigation. So a defense is supposed to stop the attack, and then a mitigation means reduce the damage the attack does. Does that make sense? And so just having more than one. So sometimes companies say, well, we'll just buy a web application firewall or a RASP, a runtime application security protection tool, which is a mouthful. We'll just put a shield in front of our app and then we're fine. I'm like, no, you still need to write good code. Come on. Yeah. So defense in depth, the idea, for instance, could be, you take secure code training and then you have someone test your app and then you have someone also do code review. That would be 3 layers of defense, if that makes sense. And you can have many, many layers. And you can have, for instance, so you can have automated tools, scan a whole bunch of things, and it will find a bunch of easy to find things. You fix those low-hanging fruit. Awesome. Well, now we're also going to maybe have our peers review each new pull request. So we're going to change some code and we're going to have someone else more senior review it and then look for these 5 things that we're concerned about, let's say. And so that would be 2 really good layers of defense. And I like to see a few, especially if an application is really old and written with older versions of the framework and has older dependencies that maybe, you'd have to re-architect the whole app in order to upgrade off of them. So it's like in the meantime, we're going to put a WAF in front and then we're going to do network segmentation. So if someone does get in there, they can't get anything else. They can't take stuff out and they can't go to the rest of the network. And so sometimes it is worth doing a lot of layers of defense. For instance, if something is very valuable to the business, or if something's very sensitive, or if something's just so old that it's like an elderly application. Like last year I worked on an application that was 38 years old. And he's like, wow, you're almost as old as me.
What was that written in? COBOL.
I know, right? But I was going on about different ways. So the company I was consulting at had bought another company and we're going to bring it into our network. And I'm like, first we have to, basically dig a moat around it, network segmentation. And we're going to do this and that. And just making sure we could bring it in safely and make sure that its weakness wouldn't affect other people. But it had 4 customers that each paid $1 million per year to use this really old thing. And so it was really valuable from a business perspective. But it's we know that in the next coming years, they're probably going to stop renewing. And until then, it's worth to continue running it. And so the business wants this, so I have to make it happen. So how can I do it safely? Going back, I wanted to mention one more thing because you asked about unhandled exceptions because you have such an awesomely named podcast.
Oh, thank you.
When we're talking about an unknown state, another thing that can happen is basically if the app fails, and you fail open. And I'm bringing it up because I saw it this morning on Twitter. A person, their username was fail open. And so if something happens and you're doing a multi-part transaction in your application and there's an error, roll the entire thing back. Roll the whole thing back and do the whole thing again. And this can be super annoying if you're a user. But for many years, race conditions have existed. Even when I was doing my very first software development job, I remember there were only 2 of us at this tiny startup I was working at. And I had tried to update something in the database and my boss was also updating it. And we inadvertently had a race condition in our super tiny company. And then I learned all about race conditions and got really excited about them. And the idea is if you're going to be updating a database field, you should be able to lock it. So I had changed it while he was using it. And what a coincidence, right? Just 2 of us at this whole company. But we saw that and we're like, oh my gosh, we need to lock the database when we're changing it so no one else can change it at the same time. And it was just, under a second worth of time. And so then when I moved into security, it turns out lots of people use this. So I really like Starbucks. And so the Starbucks bug bounty team published an article about a really cool vulnerability that they had in 2019, I think. And basically, someone as part of their bug bounty program, so there's a security researcher that's part of the program that has permission to test. He figured out a way where you could transfer money from different gift cards at the same time, and you could keep doing it to multiple cards at the same time so you could multiply your money. So he'd transfer $50 to 2 different cards at the same time, and then he'd have $100. And then he would transfer that $50 then he had $150. And he just kept doing it. And I think he named his thing Free Coffee Forever. And I was like, man, you shouldn't have taken the couple $1,000. You should have taken the free awesome coffee. Just kidding. Don't steal. But yeah, I think that a lot of us, if we're going to fail, we're like, oh, well, we're halfway through. We'll just try to recover. No, just roll everything all the way back, start again. That's the safest way to do it every time. So fail closed and roll back. Never fail open. Never try to recover the transaction and start from the middle. It's always a mess.
I guess I suppose thinking about a microservice architecture, that can be quite often quite difficult because unless you've got like a distributed transactions kind of things, but then just trying to make things where you can idempotent, so you can just like start again but redo the same thing, I guess. I like the way before you said you discovered race conditions and you got really excited. And I'm just thinking back, when I discovered race conditions, I'm still having nightmares. Oh, I'm not joking. Oh dear. I'm so like now I'm kind of getting more and more interested in functional programming because it just becomes much harder to have all these concurrency issues that like you have when you've got to deal with that kind of stuff. But yeah, I must admit I've never thought about it from a security point of view. I've always thought about like race conditions and concurrency issues, like as in it might crash. But that's a very good point about it might introduce security issues as well.
So when I joined security, I remember someone said, oh, well, it's the CIA. And I thought they meant that American government organization that have spies. And I was like, I don't think they care about our app. And he's like, no, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And I was like, excuse me? Because I didn't take security in school. I took computer science in the 90s. So basically, it is the security team's job to protect those three things. So if the availability of the app isn't there because there's a race condition, that's a security issue from our standpoint, right? And so, or if you fail open and then we mess up the final value of the transaction, that's an integrity issue. And so as a developer, I'm like, no, this is quality. Like my app's not working right. It's buggy and crappy. But those would actually be, from a security perspective, considered a vulnerability. Like if we do this and then it crashes and our clients can't use the system that we're providing to them, that's availability is broken. And then security people are concerned. And so sometimes developers are like, why are you here? I'm like, oh, because these are the three things that our team's the most, like there's other things we care about too. But if one of those three things isn't going well, the security team's on high alert, I guess is the best way to put it. And so, yeah, I didn't think of these things either, Dan. When I was a developer, I wanted my customers to be like, this is awesome, thanks. That's all I wanted to hear. Like they're happy, they're pleased, it's doing the stuff they want, it's not doing stuff they don't want. I am a cool dev. And then when I learned about security, I'm like, oh, but I can also care for my customer by protecting them. It's like, ooh, yeah.
Even like things like MFA, as a user, sometimes that can be quite annoying. But because I know what that means for security, I'm actually happy about that annoyance. And pretty much a lot of apps now just enable it because they're using kind of third-party identity providers. So it's, I don't want to say a checkbox, but it's kind of like functionality that can be added quite easily without having to build all that.
Yes. I'm hoping that as the information security and like the sub field I'm in, application security, I'm hoping we get better at making things usable for the end user. So Microsoft and some other companies are really excited about the idea of passwordless. So not having to use a password, not having to remember passwords anymore. That would be magical, Dan. Like when I was a software developer, I had basically 100 passwords for work, and they're all supposed to be unique. And my brain's only so big. I have to remember all sorts of things. I have to remember how to get home and that in my car, and I'm supposed to remember to pick up cat food and all these other things that I'm supposed to remember, plus 100 unique passwords, and then all my personal passwords. And so I'm a huge fan of password managers, so I can use my brain to remember to bring cat food and cream and eggs home, or whatever it is that I'm supposed to be doing. And I feel like the security industry is listening more now to users. Like if the security is not very usable, they find a way around it. And then we are like, oh, we look dumb now. The users are displeased. And on top of that, we're not getting what we want is for them to be safe and protected, right? And so multi-factor authentication is awesome. It is a fantastic way to stop intruders. So like, let's say your password was in a breach somewhere and the company had encrypted it instead of hashing it and salting it and or peppering it, which are things you can do to make sure it's unrecoverable. So like, it's not your fault they did a bad job and they leaked your password onto the internet. And then you're a target and you don't even know, and you didn't even do anything wrong. And so it's power that the user can take for themselves to protect themselves more by enabling multi-factor authentication. But Dan, honestly, I dream of the day where we don't even have to do that because it's handled for us invisibly. So for instance, Google will just have a pop-up on my phone that's like, is this you? I'm like, yep, that's me. Right? And just pressing a button. I don't have to put in the 6 codes. I don't have to wait for a text to arrive. And so I'm hoping eventually this stuff is invisible. To give you an example of things that implementations I've seen that I really like, I used to work in the Canadian government at this place called Shared Services Canada. And it was part of this giant campus, basically, of buildings, like 5 huge buildings. They're called phases. Anyway, and there's a ton of us nerds in there. And we made it that the moment you walked through the door, it would recognize a certificate on your machine and let you onto the network. You still had to sign in, but we had this extra layer of security. So guests were not recognized and immediately sent to the guest network. If you brought a machine from home, it's not going to work. But it's like, I'm on the property, I'm allowed in. And I feel like we need to find more ways to have security be invisible for users so that 1, they are safer, but 2, they'll actually go along with it. Because people adopting MFA, it's still like somewhere between 11 and 15%. And so that's 85 to 90% of people who aren't protected. And as a security professional, I don't like this.
And I guess also the end users that don't turn on MFA are probably the end users with either really bad passwords and or using the same password for some forum that was written by someone in the garage that is kind of like very insecure, and PayPal or something, you know what I mean? So it's kind of so important. So going back to this password, this is quite interesting, this password list that you mentioned. So what would be the factor that would replace the password? If you've got MFA, but then that's one factor, or your device, but what would replace the password side?
So super briefly, for anyone that's unaware, so there are 3 factors of authentication. And the factors are a thing you have, a thing you are, or a thing you know, right? So when you do a password, that's a thing you know. A thing you are would be a scan of your face, your fingerprint, your iris, the gait, and the way that you walk. Anything that uniquely identifies you only. So that would be a thing you are, and that is quite often the thing that is the password list. So like as you pick up your iPhone, it recognizes your face and unlocks. So that's passwordless. If you want, you can enable that. And I briefly had an iPhone. I just don't get iOS. Anyway.
You and me both.
It made me I wanted to just throw it through a window after a month. Anyway, but so other factors, like a thing that you know could be a password, but there's other things that we know, if that makes sense. So they used to have things called bingo cards, which is like old school, do not use those anymore. But it would say, what's in field 3A, and you would put, that number, and then it would get you in. Those aren't very secure. But then a thing that you have could be your phone, right? So I'll use my phone to authenticate my computer. I'll use my computer to authenticate my phone, or I'll have a little fob. Or if you have a YubiKey, you can just press the button on the side. So it's like, I have the thing, and I know the thing, and I am the thing, let me in. And I remember when I was at Microsoft, I got logged out of Cloud Shell on stage in Korea. And I'm like giving this demo, and the demo was going so badly, Dan. Because Cloud Shell kept crashing on me. I'm like, that's it, we're breaking up. I was like so embarrassed. Because it's so hard when your demo fails and there's all these smart people in the audience. And I'm like, oh no, I look so dumb. And so then it like logged me out of everything. And so then I had to use my fingerprint, my password, and then my phone as a thing I have. And I was like, that's it, triple factor authentication. And everyone clapped. And then I managed to get my app finally to publish in the very last 30 seconds of my 1 hour, whatever. I'm like, I did it. I started jumping up and down, and I got this standing ovation because they're like, she didn't give up, because I had I deployed all my infrastructure and all of it was crashing. It didn't work. So I had to destroy all of it on stage and redeploy everything from my demo. And I'm like, please, hurry, Azure. But it worked out in the end. But yeah, I want to make these things easier. And so for Apple, it's the face, and it's the same with Windows Hello for Microsoft. Like your computer, assuming you don't have a webcam cover like I do, because I'm paranoid, like you open it, it sees your face, and it's like, that's definitely Tanya's face. Let's let her in, right? So there's all these different things we can do to have passwordless. So for instance, like me walking on the property of Shared Services Canada and having it open for me. I used to work at the place that designs Canada's money and passports for a while. And we were doing facial recognition and all of this. So we would test it on each other because that's what we're like. And I remember you would walk into the building and there'd be a cage that would open and you would walk in and you'd have to badge your card. And like you're locked in the cage for like 1 minute or 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. And then you'd swipe your card so that, if it's red, you're stuck in there. But then also they had a person on duty and they had 3 different people that would rotate that knew your face. So they would personally identify you and you'd have to look and make eye contact and they'd be like, yep, that's her. And then you got in. And that I found very interesting that they had a human that had to remember you. And so if you were new, then they'd have to check your passport or whatever to let you in the first few days until they knew your face. And then I worked at the Department of Justice and they had a similar thing to that. And it was like a turnstile with like 3 spaces, those doors where you walk in and it's moving. And then, you would swipe and it would start moving. And then, it's supposed to move all the way out. Then the next person comes in. And then they also had a guard. And then we would have to go to another area, swipe in, and then we could go to the top secret bunker. And then like I am very silly and enjoy playing pranks on people I like. So I would go through the turnstile and then I would hit it with my heel and lock my friend Stacy in it because I'm a jerk. And she'd be like, no. And then she'd have to wait until the security person got around to her and they're like, oh, you're stuck in here again. She's like, oh my God, Tanya, I'm so eating your lunch today. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Going back to, you mentioned about your talk where the demo gods came into play. Talks are boring unless that happens. It just makes it like when I'm going watching talks, if it's kind of like, if it doesn't go quite right, that kind of makes it more interesting. You're not thinking that person's an idiot. It's kind of like, you want to get involved. And like, I think the audience tends to get more involved as well. As you mentioned, it's quite nice. I remember this was quite a few years ago, one talk I was doing, and it was about Kubernetes. I did like a Raspberry Pi cluster. So I was talking about Kubernetes and installing it on there. And just when I got near the end, when everything was going so well, and it was just about to show everything I built working, the battery went. Didn't have time to. So I was like, oh, but never mind. Everyone in the audience was quite nice about it.
I have had demos fail. Yeah. I remember receiving in my feedback, Tanya was so calm when her demo failed over and over again. 5 on 5 for being cool under pressure. Like, thank you, whoever you were.
I like the over and over bit. That's like kicking you when you're down, isn't it?
I know, but I'm not going to stop, right? Like if you're on stage, it's like, no, you're going to work. Because sometimes I can recover the thing or recode the thing or whatever. Yeah. It is nice when you have patient, kind, generous audiences.
I think in our industry, like from my experience, like, well, maybe I've been lucky, but the audiences are quite forgiving. They have to be to listen to me talk, to be honest. But it's kind of...
Whenever I talk to people that are considering giving a talk at like a meetup or work, or they're thinking of applying to their first conference, a piece of advice that someone gave me is the audience wants you to succeed. No one goes to a meetup and they're like, I hope the presenter really sucks. They all are hoping that you're good and they're all pulling for you. And most of the people in the audience, either one have never done a presentation before and most likely find the prospect intimidating. So they're kind of impressed that you're doing it, or they have done it before and they know how darn hard it is. And so either way, they tend to have a ton of empathy for the person up there. It's very rare. People are like, I hope you screw up. And that's usually like a person that you know personally. And maybe you like, I don't know, have a weird situation for whatever. Like generally most audiences are like, I want this person to be awesome. I'm totally rooting for them. Before my first presentation ever that wasn't at work, was at the OWASP chapter. And right before I got up, like I'd been the chapter leader for a few years at this point. So most of the people in the audience were my friends. And to me, that's the most terrifying because I'm like, I care what you all think so much. All of you are awesome. And I know you personally, so I know how smart you are. And so for me, that's more fearful than a bunch of strangers. And one of them told me, he's like, don't you understand? We love you. You're our chapter leader. You're like our chapter's mascot. If you go up there and drool on yourself, we'd probably still tell you did a good job because we're just so happy that you're doing this. Like you're excited and like you've presented hosted for years. And now like, this is your chance to shine. And we're like all so excited for you. And I was like, oh, I didn't think of it that way. Right. Like, he's like, we're not there to judge you. We're here to support you. So go be awesome. And I was like, oh, thank you, Alex. That's amazing. And I just felt so much better. And all these different people from my chapter, I'd ask them to like, let me practice on them too. And then they were in the audience and like, go, Tanya, go. And I was just, very supportive. And so, if you are up there and your demo fails, remember, everyone really wants your demo to succeed and everyone is definitely cheering for you. And like, whenever something like that happens, I just try to remember that. And then I'm like, okay, cool down, just focus on what's wrong and let's get to the bottom of this. Yeah.
I'm just curious. At one point then you said no one wants you to fail unless it's someone that knows you personally. That sounds like a story though.
I haven't had that before, but my first conference talk, I did a demo and the demo failed. Unbeknownst to me, someone had hacked this demo website like late the night before, or because I was practicing in the evening before. So sometime when I was sleeping and had like basically taken the site apart. And I didn't know that my demo failed. And I tried a few times and I was like, well, whatever, you get the picture. You're hackers. You understand. And then I just continued. And then a speaker later that afternoon. So English was his second language. And I knew this person and I thought he liked me. And he said during his talk, well, as we know, some people really know security and some people don't, like we saw in Tanya's talk. And he came up to me. So then there was like a pin dropped and you would have heard it. Everyone was so quiet. And I felt like sick. I was like, oh my God, that's so mean. I'm trying so hard. Like, this is my first conference. I was also the first woman to ever speak at this conference. And it had been existing for like 10 years. And I'm the first woman ever. And then like my talk gets trashed by another speaker on stage. And so after he comes up to me and he's like, did you like my joke? And I was like, what joke? And he's like, I said, some people don't know security and some people really do, like Tanya. And I was like, no, that's not what you said. You said it the opposite way. And he's like, oh my God. And then he was so upset. And he's like, I wonder if I can go back on stage and apologize. Oh my gosh. And like, he has a huge accent when he speaks. So it's really obvious it's his second language. And he like gave me a hug. He's like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And so then he was like super awkward trying to explain himself to everyone for the rest of the afternoon. But I was just like, oh, I thought you were kind of saying like Tanya's a dum-dum. And he's like, no. And so then he is like, I'm never going to try to make jokes in English again. But seriously, the audience's reaction was, you're mean, buddy, and we don't like you. And he had like almost no applause at the end of his talk because people were just like, how dare you insult this junior speaker? It's like her first time. And it was interesting how supportive the audience was of me. And yeah, he had to, and it wasn't on purpose. And that was the thing that made it so extra weird. But in all the hundreds of talks that I've given, I've only like 3 times had like an audience member be a problem during question period. And I just made them sorry. That's a thing women fear a lot. They fear that someone will be really cruel to them in question period. And I remember someone was being a problem and I was like, sir, zip it. People are here to hear me, not to hear a monologue from you. You have not asked a question. He's like, I'm getting to it. I'm like, actually, you're done and you can sit down. And he was like, what? And he was being like openly really rude and just like spouting on this soliloquy forever. And he was like, no, I'm like, sit down. You're done. Does anyone else have an actual question? And so then the next day he came up to me and he's like, may I please buy you a beer? Because I thought all night about your talk and why I was so upset. And it was about how security teams can sometimes be really mean to software developers and how we could work better together because that's going to end up with better software in the end. And like ways where we could get along better, ways where we security folks could change the way we do our processes, the way we communicate, etc. So not only is it a happier place to work, we just build way more secure software. And he's like, I was the guy that says no every time. I did so many things that you said not to do during your talk. And I couldn't sleep the whole night. I ended up waking up in the middle of the night, talking to my wife about it. And she's like, I think you owe that young lady an apology. And he's like, so I want to buy you a beer and I want to apologize to you from the bottom of my heart. And you have changed the way that I'm going to do my job from now on. And then he gave me this big bear hug. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And yeah, so it's coming from somewhere and it's probably not you.
Yeah, definitely. That is such a good story because it's just that when you first started saying it and how he was treating you, but then the fact that overnight he actually didn't sleep and was talking about it and it completely changed, hopefully, the way he deals with people moving forward. That's brilliant.
Yeah. And it sounds weird, but I've had so many women from that audience specifically write me to say, when you told him, zip it, sit down, the stage is mine. I think I said something like, I worked my butt off to be able to get accepted to this conference and to be able to have the right to stand on the stage and talk. You did not. It's been 2 minutes. You're done talking now. Sit down. And she's like, I just can't believe you did that because as a woman, I get talked over all the time. I get this, I get that. And I was like, thank you. Because I'm going to try that next time someone just bulldozes over me in a meeting. And I'm going to say, I'm not done speaking yet. And she's like, I need to learn that sentence. And I've had like maybe 4 or 5 women be like, that was really important for me to see. And I was like, oh, well, I used to play music in bars. And I literally have kicked people and thrown people, like by throwing, I mean mostly like push, I'm not strong enough to lift them, off of stages because they're hammered and they're doing something stupid. And so it's way easier to deal with sober technology professionals than that. Memories.
Brilliant. So I suppose going back to app security, I guess one key thing nowadays is automation and tooling. And it feels like now you've got like CI/CD pipelines and you're trying to automate, you've got automated tests and everything. Presumably there's a big story around tooling and this kind of security testing too.
Dan, it is such an exciting time. So when I started in AppSec, basically you would do SAST and DAST. So SAST is static application security testing. So the original type of tools, they would parse out your app. I don't know if you ever took a compilers class in school, but I had to create a compiler when I was young. So it all like made sense in my brain. And then it does symbolic execution, like looking for any potential vulnerability. And there would be like a zillion false positives. And then there was DAST, dynamic application security testing, or as I affectionately like to call it, pew, 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 pew. And like it interacts with your application and you use the application and it watches you and then it tries, it sends its own requests, it reads the responses and it tries to script out attacks for you and it interacts as your app does stuff. So it's dynamic. And I learned dynamic testing first and then some manual security testing to become a junior pen tester. And for me, I found that a lot easier than static analysis because there were just so many false positives and I didn't know how to tell the difference for a long time. It took me years to get decent at SAST. But if you literally, I remember my first pen test, my professional mentor on a Friday said, you start Monday, please learn Burp Suite over the weekend. Because Monday at 5 p.m., you're doing your first pen test. That was terrifying. That was so terrifying. I made a big mess. You can damage things if you are not careful. And I did. Also, now that I know a lot more, that was absolutely inappropriate of him to set me live with zero training on a production website for a corporation. But I digress. And so I found it a lot easier. So I liked it better. But now, so I work for Bright and they make a DAST. And I remember when they told me, they're like, yeah, we're going to make a DAST. I'm like, so what? Who cares? There's already 50. And they're like, no, we're going to make a DAST that's for software developers, not for security professionals. I don't want you to need to do 1 year training to be good. you can like press 5 buttons and go, and it won't make a mess, and it's perfectly safe. And so we're making it for non-security professionals. So you can go and find a bunch of things really fast. And I was like, ooh, tell me more about this. Like, oh, I can't accidentally like destroy my entire database. Tell me more.
It's always a good sign.
Yeah. And then there's not just Bright, there's so many other companies doing really cool innovations. Like there's lots of companies now that specialize in testing APIs. There's this company called 42 Crunch, and I don't own any part. I just like them. And they have a free IDE plugin that will basically audit your definition file or your schema for your API, and it'll harden it for you. So it's like, hey, you should put this in. Hey, you should put that in. Did you know you're missing this? And I remember using it at a client site. I'm like, I look like a genius now. Thanks, buddy. And it's free. And so if you, as a developer, go and look through all the different plugins, so let's say you're using like Visual Studio Code, or you're using IntelliJ or Eclipse. So those are all super popular. There are so many cool plugins that are free. And I think that's ridiculously awesome. I feel like the world is your oyster right now as a software developer. So you can plug a lot of things into your IDE. So you're earlier in the system development lifecycle. Then during the CI/CD, you can add even more stuff. So you can run SAST and DAST, and there's new generation static testing tools that are, they'll run in 10 minutes instead of 10 hours, which is really exciting. And they do their analysis in a totally new way. But there's also, so Dan, I don't know if you've ever had this, but when I was the senior dev, I worked somewhere and we had acquired a bunch of other places. So I actually had 5 teams underneath me, and they brought a total of 72 apps. But actually it was close to 100. They just weren't on lists. And so we would have a security problem. And I'm like, that's not on my list. What? I'm responsible for this too. Guys, you've got to tell me what I'm responsible for. And so we did this huge inventory exercise, and it took forever, Dan. It was a lot of work. It was expensive. It was very manual. And this year, 4 different startups have come up with automated tools that will find all your web apps and all your APIs. It won't find like things written in C, etc., like Windows Forms apps. They won't find those things, but they'll find all your webby stuff. I'm like, this is huge. And so basically I'm seeing like cooler and cooler stuff, and it's very exciting to be a nerd in this space. And because I have a lot of Twitter followers and like a popular-ish blog, sometimes I can rate these companies and ask for a demo, and they actually say yes. And so I get to see it firsthand. Usually I invite them to demo for the We Hack Purple community. And like, it's not a sales pitch. You show off all the cool stuff, but like, that's it. You just show it off. You answer questions, like you show us a demo, and then you can't harass them after, just they reach out to you if they're interested. And so I've got to see like IAST tools, RASP tools. Like this one company made like a tool to find out if you had log4j anywhere, which was a big vulnerability late last year. And so it's very fascinating to me, all the cool new innovations. And even older companies are innovating in new ways. Like one company that makes a SAST, like the old original unique style, and then they're making a dynamic scanner that clicks in, and so then they're correlating their results together to give you 2 different versions of the same bug. Like, that's so cool. Yeah, so I'm very excited to see what's next.
I just love how excited you are getting about this. And we said at the start about trying to persuade me to get into AppSec. It's kind of, it's getting there, it's getting there. It does sound really fascinating. It's kind of, I'm quite really fascinated in anything you can automate, automating stuff, DevOps stuff, like any form of automation. I'm currently like really interested in Playwright because that's UI automation, but that's kind of like a separate thing. But anything automation, and being able to plug this stuff into that automation. I know you've got like things like if you're using Docker, so you can like have security testing on your Docker images as you build them, which test the different layers and the tools you mentioned. If you can put all these in your pipelines, and I suppose even if things do take a bit longer to run, if you've got different environments, you can choose when the longer tests get run. It's not, you've got to run every single kind of test. So now when you're doing like mobile development or something, and you've got like the different mobile device testing services, I can't remember what they're called. There's one I'm thinking of, I've blanked on it. But because it tests so many different mobile devices, every time you make a change, you can't run all of those tests. But having like different gates which run different levels of test depending on what's changed, that kind of thing. It's all quite fascinating.
Another thing that I found is that, so I remember saying to someone like, oh, like I'm trying to do all these things in like the one release pipeline. And he's like, you're allowed more than one pipeline. I was like, shut up. Really? And so then I realized, okay, so I could have the release pipeline that actually eventually goes out to prod. But for every like major release that they did, I had a second pipeline that would run overnight, and it'd be like the full out, do that 6-hour slow scan, buddy, do all the things. And I had it create a Docker container inside of my GitHub Actions. And then it does all the tests, then it destroys the container after. So it's way cheaper, and I don't have to maintain that thing all the time. And so then I'd come in the morning and I'd have this report in my email, and they still were able to release last night because they didn't, all the super critical tests I did pass. But it's like, oh, I found some medium things. You know, I want to talk about those. Do you have time later this week? I want to see, you know, some of them in your next sprint, or some of them can just go into the backlog, and some of them probably we're fine with. And so being able to have like more than one pipeline run at the same time, and one just goes really long and it doesn't actually release anywhere real. It's ephemeral. It like disappears. I was just like, oh my God, I feel like I have so much power as a security person. Like, you know, you have to negotiate if you're adding something to someone else's pipeline. Like, can I have 8 minutes, please? But if you're making your own pipeline and it's asynchronous and it doesn't actually deploy anywhere, I can have 18 hours if I want to. No one cares because it's mine. And as a security professional, like when I was this junior pen tester, so not only was I usually an external consultant, but I'm junior. And I've always looked a bit young for my age, so everyone always thinks I'm a kid. I'm like, I'm not a kid. I went to school in the 90s. Finally, I have space to do like destructive testing. I can do like a stress test. I can do, you know what I mean? Like I can really push it to its limits, and I'm not ruining someone else's day. I'm not doing something super expensive for my organization. Like I found it just, I'm not sure what the word, like I felt free. I felt free to do the work that I really wanted to do. Because Dan, I don't know if you've ever had to work on something that needs serious stress testing. So years ago when I was a dev, I made an app and it had a memory leak in it. And it did a lot of recursion. Brought me back to my college days. And it had a leak in the recursion. And it was a tiny leak. And I just crashed prod like 9 times in 40 minutes. And everyone was very displeased with me. So I've been very conscious of memory since then. And so then when I worked at Elections Canada, unlike other countries, Canada has one group that runs their federal election across the entire country. Well, other countries, some of them, each province or each state does their own. And so we have it all under one roof. And Canada is also the second biggest country in the world, and we have the Arctic. So almost all of us live as close to America's border as possible because it's warm there, but everyone in the Arctic still gets to vote. And so our software had to run on 32 kilobit modems. If we had any leaks, that wasn't going to work. And so we had to do super, super intense, creative, weird style testing to make sure it was like so fast and so perfect. And we could do it because of that, right? And anyway, it's very exciting for me.
Very cool. I'm kind of like quite mindful of the time at the moment. And before we do wrap up, I really, really want to talk about, well, 2 things. Your book and also your community, We Hack Purple.
Awesome.
Maybe let's start with the book. It's Alice and Bob Learn Application Security. So I'm afraid, hands up, I haven't actually read it, but I started to read, but I've looked through the contents on O'Reilly, and it covers a lot of stuff. I've got such a long to-do list of books to read, but it's definitely on there. It does sound quite fascinating. And actually, I noticed it's on Audible, and I've got an Audible credit. So maybe that's the option.
I'm the narrator of my own book because I did voice work professionally for 17 years. And usually, like, they don't make a textbook into an audiobook. So Alice and Bob are characters from my industry. So when the cryptographers invented encryption and all the other things, they wanted to explain to all us normal humans who aren't mathematicians what they were doing. And so they said, Alice wants to tell Bob a secret, and she doesn't want anyone else to know. And Bob needs to know it's from Alice and not from someone else. How do we do that with computers? And so Alice and Bob are very famous. And so I'd always use examples saying Alice and Bob. And so people were saying I should name my book The Application Security Handbook. But I was like, what if we name it Alice and Bob Learn Application Security? Because I use them constantly throughout the book. So Alice and Bob both have jobs, they have families, they have health conditions. I'm dyslexic. And so writing a textbook when you're a dyslexic person, my book's a little different. So I studied how people write books and how people learn so that I could learn French as an adult. So this is going to sound bad, but I found computer science very, very simple. It just clicked with my brain. And, most of my aunts and uncles are all computer scientists. My mom's a mathematician chemist. My dad is a technologist. So my brain is wired for that. So I found computer science class very easy. But when I was an adult trying to learn French, it felt like the most impossible task on the planet. And so I studied how people learn. And there's 21 different learning styles. And so I decided in my book, I would try to cover many different ways. And that's why I fought really hard to have an audiobook. I went with a publisher that was willing to do that because some people need to hear it to learn properly. And so I explain all the complex concepts at least 2 times, but preferably 3 times in different ways. So I'll give you a technical description of something, and then I'm like, here's some code, here's a diagram, and here's a story of how this affects Alice's life. And so there's all these stories in it and images and descriptions and code. Like there's maybe only 4 pages of code total. But the idea is that then if the super technical description does it for you, awesome, you've got that. But if you're like, oh, I'm still a little fuzzy, there's all these different ways that I'll explain, and I'll come back to a thing like we talked about before. A CI/CD means this. My goal was to create the book that I wish I had when I started down this field, and then to make the book as easy as possible to understand. So even like my mom and grandma read a few chapters, and I've had lots of people tell me, chapter 4, the secure coding, was completely out of my league, just going to be honest, but I read all the design stuff and I understood. I read how to do continuous learning and I understood. I read these different parts and I understood, and I did not think I could know that. And now I know, and I'm, yes. And so I'm actually, a few months ago, I started writing my second book, Alice and Bob Learn Secure Coding. It's going to be a lot more technical, but there's still stories of Alice and Bob. There's still going to be diagrams. And I'm working with this really awesome human who's going to make comic strips in the book to explain. My first one is identity and access management. And it's like, is Tanya doing this? Is Tanya doing that? Like, can we explain this like with a cool comic? Because I love XKCD. I don't know if you've heard of that comic.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
a giant, huge fan of that dude.
I'm surprised Bobby Tables has. That's XKCD, isn't it? Bobby Tables.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, I'm surprised that hasn't been mentioned earlier, to be honest. But
yes. And so I want to basically do as many different angles as I can to help everyone learn, because this didn't exist when I started. And when I was a developer, if I could just read a book that would explain, like, what the heck is least privilege? And why are you doing it to me? Because I have to say, on the receiving end, if you don't understand why they're taking away all your superpowers, it feels bad. And yeah, so that's my goal, is to make books that people can understand and hopefully enjoy reading. Like, I had a bunch of people say, I laughed out loud reading your textbook. I'm like, yes.
I think that's it. You mentioned about the name before, and it just sounds so much more fun and approachable, the name, rather than the other one you said, application security, textbook or whatever. It just sounds so much more fun. So from an Audible point of view, do you feel that you're getting everything you would get if you, like, as in, I don't know whether you've got code snippets in the book, which I don't know how you do that in an Audible book. By listening to the Audible book, are you getting everything you would get from the book?
There are a bunch of PDFs that come with the Audible book. And I have to say, when I read out the code, it sounds awful. And we couldn't figure out a way to make it sound really good. And then that's why we made a downloadable PDF. So it's like, if you just want to skip this part, it's all in your downloadable PDF, and it's this part. So go to this page, and this is where those code samples are. And then there was a graph. So I did security user stories or abuse cases, and it is in a graph format. And that also came out really weird. So we put it also in a PDF. So I'm told that those 2 parts, and I agree, it's kind of confusing to understand what I'm getting at exactly and visualize it. And the actual graph, when you look at it, it's a lot more clear. But the rest of it apparently came off really well. And because I did voice work for so long, people are like, yeah, you're cute. The way you sound excited when you read certain parts and, blah, 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 zero trust. Yeah. It's a different type of book, that's for sure. And I've got really good reviews, which feels wonderful. When you work really hard on something for 2 years, it's pretty, I felt really nervous putting it out into the world. I'm like, I hope more than just my mom buys it. And then you also asked about We Hack Purple. So We Hack Purple is the company I started that was acquired by Bright Security earlier this year. And so we took all of our academy classes and put them into the community, and the community is free. And then since then, we've actually released an additional course. So I think we either have 10 or 11 courses in there. And then we have live events every month that are free. And then we have a channel that's just silly computer memes. We have all these different channels where people can share. And we have a giant volunteer team that help me run it. And so we have a strict code of conduct. And we've had to give someone a talking to once. And then they've been awesome ever since. And we've never had to kick anyone out, which is super amazing. It's like my favorite corner of the internet, if that makes sense. So, and it's not just AppSec anymore. So I had people join and they do forensics, or they do incident response, or they do threat hunting, etc. And so now we have many, many topics that I am definitely not an expert in, and then I get to learn from them. And so we've actually had volunteers running their own events and doing their own speaking things, and people are writing their first blog post ever and sharing it in We Hack Purple. And so if you're a member, you can create content and share content and run events too. You just have to follow the code of conduct. And so we have people talk about privacy, and someone's really excited about MFA, and he actually wants to put on a 1-day event. I'm like, this is so amazing. And with so many people leaving Twitter right now because they're upset about politics, I'm just going to say that, we're having 50 or 60 people a day join We Hack Purple. And we're like, yeah, even if you just want to come and figure out where you want to go, it's welcoming to everyone. And it's not Tanya's community anymore. It's our community. We actually run a lot of things like a democracy. So we'll actually vote on stuff. And the thing I voted for does often win, but I'm okay with them voting something. And I'm like, okay, so I guess we're doing this on Friday now. Everyone voted. That's what we're doing. And I really like that. And I feel like I'm enjoying the community more now that more volunteers and members of the community are sharing their thoughts. Because at first it was just me every month presenting. And I'm like, I already know me. I want to know you. And so that's been really beautiful to watch unfold over the years. So we're 3 years old now. We're almost 4. It's so exciting. Anyway, I digress.
I can imagine. You mentioned about your book as well, where just something you've worked so hard and actually seeing it happen, people buy it. And
we had to reprint it this year because all of the copies sold, and they've now done a full next printing, and I almost started crying. I was so excited. That's so amazing because I used to be a professional musician, and I would do a print of CDs. I never had to do a second print. It's so exciting that all of them sold in about a year and a half. And during a international pandemic, right? I feel a lot of gratitude.
Yeah, definitely. And with the community stuff as well, it's kind of definitely not to the same level as yours done, but I used to run a small .NET user group, and most of the talks are just full-length talks, but we quite often have lightning talk events, so they're much smaller lightning talks. And the satisfaction when people do a lightning talk, especially when it's in person, when it's a bit more virtual at the moment, but when it's in person, and it's the first time they've ever got up on stage, they're doing a talk because of the community that you've built. It's just so satisfying.
Oh, yeah. It's so, it literally warms my heart.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm aware you have a hard stop pretty much now. So before we do wrap up, where's the best place for listeners to reach out to you if they have any questions?
They should look up She Hacks Purple, all one word, anywhere. And that's me. So shehackspurple.ca. I have a newsletter, a blog, etc. Please visit We Hack Purple. So you just go to community.wehackpurple.com, and I'm there. And obviously the company that bought us, brightsec.com. So visit me at any of those places, and I cannot wait to hear from you.
Magic. And I'll make sure I include a link to all of these things in the show notes too. So with that, I just want to say a massive thank you for joining us on the show. It's been amazing chatting with you.
Dan, thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
Yeah, it's been great fun. And thank you everyone for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter at Dracan, Dracan, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And the show notes, including all links to things we've mentioned today, can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.